Hi everybody, my name is Paul Price. I am the Vice President of the Vero Beach Orchid Society. I want to welcome you guys here to Busy Bee. We have a great turnout today. Thank you for coming down. Hopefully by the time you leave here today, I will teach you a little bit about orchids. Hopefully enough to get you interested where you will buy some more orchids. I want to do a quick question because we've got a pretty good crowd here. How many people have, say, 1 to 10 orchids at home? Raise your hand. All right. As I go up in numbers, drop your hands. If you've got 20 to 30 orchids, drop your hands. Okay, 40 to 50. 50 to 100. 100 to 200. 300. 400. You got to catch up. Those of you that know, when you get into orchids, you usually start out with one that's given to you as a gift, and the hobby tends to grow from there. We don't call it a hobby in the industry, we call it an addiction. The only cure for it is another orchid. That's why I have a greenhouse in the backyard the size of their greenhouse with 400 plants in it. Once it starts, it never stops, and it just gets worse. So once you get into orchids, I hope you like ramen noodles and peanut butter and jelly. How many of you have, let's do a quick rundown. How many of you have Phalaenopsis at home right now? Okay. Most of them should be either spiking or in spike or blooming right now. It's their time of year naturally. If you've got them out in the landscape, it takes a little bit for the ones that you've got in the landscape to actually initiate the flower spike and bloom. Now is their normal time of bloom period. Usually you didn't used to be able to buy them before January. Now with the way the growers are growing them, they're growing them in greenhouses where they actually cool the greenhouses down every night for about 2 to 3 weeks. Where they initiate the flower spikes. So if you're not getting them to bloom, if you've got them inside the house, you want to put them outside so they cool off every night. Now, if the temperature goes below 50 degrees, you want to bring it in. If it goes down to right about 50, you should be okay. But anything below 50, bring it inside so it doesn't get that cold. Phales don't like to get that cold. What will happen is sometimes the buds will fall off, or if it's a really bad cold spell, you can kill the plant. How many of you have Cataleyas at home? All right, Cataleyas are what you typically associate with orchids besides the Phalaenopsis. They used to use them for corsages. They've gotten away from that. They really need to go back to it. I wish the florists would get on the ball and do that. They're probably one of the most recognized orchids that you'll find. They're actually very easy to grow, especially out in the landscape. How many of you grow your orchids outside in the yard? Just pretty much about 50% of you. How many of you have put them on trees in the landscape? Actually taken them out of the pots and attached them to the trees? Yep. They do fantastic here in Vero Beach because our climate is exactly what they replicate in the wild. So they will grow very well in here, here in the climate. There is an orchid, there's actually 2 orchids here in Vero Beach that have been out on trees for over 50 to 60 years. One of them is bigger than my truck. The other one was about the size of both these tables put together. One's in Johns Island and one's out by, not Humiston Park, but what's the other park on the north side? JC Park. It's actually probably about three or 4 blocks from JC Park. And when that thing blooms, usually in May and June, there's a 20-foot halo around the tree of flower spikes when it blooms. It grows up in the crotch of an oak tree, and when it spikes out, the flower spikes are about 8 to 10 feet long and just blooms its heart out. Now they've been through all the cold snaps that we've had. They've been through all the hurricanes out in the landscape without any issues. So if you're concerned about plants when you put them out in the landscape, don't be. They'll actually acclimate and do very well. Just watch where you put it and how much light it gets. And we'll go into how much light orchids can take in a little bit. All right. What I want to do is brief you a little bit on the different types of orchids. And I'm going to concentrate today on the three main types that you're going to see in the marketplace predominantly, which are going to be the Phalaenopsis, the Cataleyas, and Vandas. I'm not going to get too close to this because I don't know if it's going to squelch or not. How many of you grow Vandas? Okay, great. We'll fix that, and the rest of you need to catch up. I have 100 of them in my backyard. So every time it gets cold, you see me running them all inside. After the cold's gone, I put them back outside. So that's always fun. Thank you, sir. Okay. After the program, you guys all filled out a slip for the raffle? Yes? Okay. We'll be drawing four raffle tickets at the end, so don't run off before we're done. What I wanted to talk about now with the orchids is we'll start with a Phalaenopsis, and then we'll move to Cataleyas, and then we'll go to Vandas. My favorite orchids to grow are obviously Vandas and a different form of Cataleyas. They're easy to grow. They grow really well in the landscape. Phalaenopsis, I tend to kill them. I don't know why, but I kill them. I can grow the others, but it's just the watering regimen that you have to have with them. There are some tricks to get around that, and I'll show you how to do that when we do a little bit of repotting during the talk. Phalaenopsis, everybody knows what a phale is. How many of you know that this is now the #1 potted plant that's sold in the country now? It has now replaced the poinsettia. Unfortunately, though, they're growing them as throwaway plants. People will buy them in bloom, stick them on the counter in the house. Once they're done blooming, they throw them away, they give them away, or they just stick them outside, forget about them, and don't do anything with them. Phales can be put out in the landscape. They do need to be watered a little bit more frequently, and there's a reason for that. And I'll show you the difference between the phale and the Cataleya and the Vanda as to why the watering requirements are a little bit different. Now, when you look at orchids, how many of you know where to put them according to how much light they're going to get? What's the normal thing that everybody tells you where an orchid grows? Partial sun, dappled light. That's true and that's not true. You can grow them in full sun. If you acclimate them, you cannot grow this orchid in full sun. You'll crucify it. You'll cook it. The Cataleyas and the Vandas, you can actually acclimate them to grow out into some full sun. So if you're going to put them out in the landscape, now is the time of year when you want to be doing it so that the sun is not as intense and it's not as hot. That way, as the season goes on, they have a chance to acclimate to the brighter, hotter sun. And I'll talk about mounting in a little bit. Now, the reason I'm talking about that is when you look at the leaves on an orchid, each leaf on the plants are going to tell you where it wants to grow. If you look at a leaf on a plant and consider it as a solar collector, it's trying to collect light. All right? The bigger, the wider the leaf is, the more light it's trying to collect. So that's telling you that it's actually growing in deeper shade. Now, the longer, thinner the leaf is, that tells you that it's growing in brighter light. Now, there's always the exception to the rule, but that's a basic way to tell where you should be growing that orchid. Now, if you've got an orchid and it's not flowering, you can't get it to bloom, what's the one thing that you should be doing with them? I heard it. Who said it? The F word. Absolutely right. You should be fertilizing them. If it's not blooming and you're not getting it to do something, how often are you fertilizing it? How much light is it getting? You'll be surprised at how much light orchids actually will want to bloom. If it's not blooming, stick it in an area where it gets a little bit brighter light, and it should eventually flower for you. The reason I talked about the leaf shape is it tells you how to or where to put it out in the landscape so that you know what to do. And I want to show you something also. I thought I had some sunburn on this, and I don't. How many of you burned your orchids in the sun? Everybody knows what that looks like. You get this big bleached out spot, and then it turns brown, and then you know that material, that part of the leaf will usually fall off, or that leaf will fall off. That happens, especially when the sun's starting to come back up higher in the sky. So this time of year, start watching your orchids, where you put them. When you start putting them out in the landscape, make sure that, you know, during the middle of the day, they're not getting blasted with full sun. If you're doing it around the south side of the house and the sun's beating down, watch your windows behind the orchids, because sometimes that light can reflect back on the plant and you don't think that you're burning it, but you can actually do that. So, you know, those are a couple of tips because I've done it myself. The reason I like to talk about the different leaf shapes is because it shows you where you can grow them, or how much light they'll take. I like to look for plants that will do well out in the landscape, that I know I can put on the side of a palm tree or an oak tree and just watch them grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. I like larger orchids because they give you more flowers. They give you bigger flowers, and it's just a bigger show. Vandas. Let's talk a little bit about Vandas. Now you can see the leaf shape on these guys. It's a longer leaf and it's a skinnier leaf. So that tells you it will grow in actually very bright light. Now if you look at all three of these orchids, they're all nice and bright, you know, Kelly green. They're not yellowish in any fashion. They pretty much a dark green on them. That's telling you that they've been growing in an orchid house or a shade house. So they've not been getting full sun. If you buy an orchid now and you decide to put it out in the landscape, be gentle with it. Expose it to the east side where it gets morning light, and that way it can start adjusting as the sun comes up. As time goes on, you can start adjusting it to brighter and brighter light. Once you get a Vanda out in the landscape and it's happy, it's getting enough light, you can get it to bloom 3 to 4 times a year, if not more. They will actually bloom their little hearts out. The only issue with Vandas is you have to watch them like the phales with cold weather. Vandas don't like 50 degrees or below. What happens with a Vanda is the lower leaves will turn yellow and they'll fall off. Vandas are probably one of the most beautiful orchids that you're going to see besides some of the bigger Cataleyas. The varieties that are out there are unlimited, and they will get rather big. I've got a couple at the house that are, I would say, 7 feet tall, and you know, 7 or 8 kikis on them. Everybody knows what a kiki is. Kiki is Hawaiian for baby. Kiki is actually what you would consider a new growth or a new plant growing off the bottom or side of the plant. So that's how you propagate and get new ones also. Pardon me? K-E-I-K-E.
Can you tell us how you separate that from the mom?
Yes, I will. I will when we do the repotting. Kikis, you know, typically when you do a kiki, when you want to separate it from the plant, her question is, how do you separate it from the plant? Kikis you want to try and leave on there as long as possible. They want to have at least 4 roots on them, and those roots need to be at least 3 to 4 inches long before you try and separate it from the main plant. Usually what I recommend on Vandas is you take a clean, sterile razor blade and just slice right at the base of the plant from the kiki to the parent plant. And it has to be a sterile, clean cut. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. It can be tricky because you don't want to cut the roots off, so good luck.
Because I killed all, they had 3 of them on there, and I took other plant, everything died on.
Okay. Just once that happens, just make sure that they have enough roots and the roots are long enough so that that kiki can actually support itself, because once you separate it, the mother plant is not feeding it anymore. So it has to be able to be able to feed itself. Okay? Good. Let's see. Let's talk about repotting. How many of you have repotted your own orchids or take them to somebody else and go help? I do that all the time. It still hasn't worked. Repotting is not as imposing or difficult as you may think. It's actually fairly simple. It's easy to do. Don't let it intimidate you. When you get a plant that you've had for a while, like this is in a 4-inch pot. This obviously needs to be repotted. It's outgrown the pot. The pot's done. It was started in Spagna Moss, and now I've got an invasive type of fern growing in it. This plant needs to be taken out of the pot. The roots need to be cleaned off. That fern needs to be taken out of there, and then it needs to be repotted. Now, once they get to this size, you can either divide them and make another plant out of, make several plants out of one plant, or you can leave it as one plant and let it grow into a bigger plant. I like the bigger plants because they're better for showing, and you get a better bloom out of them. I'm not going to divide this one because when I pulled it out of my greenhouse, I discovered a little issue with it. Everybody sees the white fuzzy stuff on the bottom of the leaf? And we can pass this around. The white fuzzy stuff on the bottom of the leaf is what you call mealy bug. Oop, that's okay. They bounce. Believe me, they fall off the bench at home all the time. The white stuff on the bottom is actually mealy bug or scale. There's an easy way to get rid of that. You can take just basic rubbing alcohol, put it on a paper towel or a cotton ball, saturate the paper towel and cotton ball, and just wipe it off. It comes right off. If you look at the top part of the leaf where the mealy bug is, you'll see that the leaf is turned brown and yellow. That's from the insect feeding off the juices in the leaf. So you do want to, when you're looking at your orchids in your collections, you want to watch your orchids and see that that's not happening. Look at the top. If you suspect that there's something going on, turn the plant over, look at the underside of the leaves. Yes, you have a question?
Where's the furry thing?
That's the fern that's growing in that pot. So it's a really invasive fern, and the problem with that fern is when you go to feed the orchid, that fern will absorb all the orchid fertilizer before the orchid actually gets it. It'll soak it right up before the orchid roots actually open up and start absorbing that fertilizer. So you don't want to get that in there. It will also choke out the roots on the orchid, so you really don't want that in that pot. I've done a lot of mounting in the landscape with people, and I used to use Spagna Moss to do my mounting with, this stuff. The problem with that is out in the landscape is I found that all the orchids that I've done mounting with out in the landscape now have that fern growing in them. And they're on trees, and it's almost impossible to get out of them. So I've stopped using Spagna Moss when I mount orchids directly on trees. Once you mount them on the trees out of the pots, you do have to water them more frequently because they dry out almost instantly. Yes, question.
How do you actually mount them on the trees?
I'll cover that in a little bit. Right after we get done with repotting, I'll show you guys and I'll tell you how you can do it. It's actually very easy. There are only a couple of simple basic rules to do it. Okay. The reason I'm passing that around to let you guys see what's going on is there are ways to get rid of that. I brought some products out here that Dan and Tina carry that you can use to eradicate that if you need to. The biggest problem with our area is not so much scale anymore, it's thrips. Everybody knows what a thrip is? A thrip is that little sliver of an insect. It looks like a little tiny black grain of rice. How many of you have gardenias at home? You have thrips. I'll guarantee it. If you've got an oak tree in the yard, you've got thrips. Thrips are what we call no-see-ums. They're a tiny little insect, and what they do is they have a tongue on them that goes around on the plant and actually grasps the surface of the plant to get the juices from the leaf of the plant or from the flower buds. They're our #1 problem in this area. The problem with thrips now is they are now resistant to every pesticide we've got out there. Thrip. Kind of like a little black dot, but a little more elongated. Really tiny, really tiny insects. That's the #1 problem right now. And the University of Florida is doing a study at an orchid grower that I know of. And they're trying to figure out what chemicals they can use now to try and eradicate them. Yes?
Are thrips the insect that is harming the citrus?
No. That's a psyllid that causes citrus greening, totally different critter, but just as bad. Yes. If you're out in your landscape and you're being bitten and you're not seeing mosquitoes and your legs are itching, it's thrips. Dan and Tina have a product here that's a cream that I started using. You can put it on your legs and they will stop biting you. It's a little cream that they have here that's a herbal remedy that you can actually put on your legs. It smells kind of nice. You put it on your legs and the thrips don't bite. Mosquitoes won't bite you either. I don't remember the name, but ask anybody here and they'll know what it is. I think they had it in the orchid room, in the aromatherapy. Yes?
Is there a biological control?
She's asking if there's a biological control for thrips. No, not that I know of. Unfortunately, it just comes with the territory. It's really been a big problem, especially with a lot of the orchid growers, because they blast all the flowers before they actually bloom, and they disfigure the flowers. So their thrips are #1 problem. There is a product here that you can still use that's fairly effective. Everybody knows what orthine is, or that fire ant controller that says orthine on it, or there's a industry name for acephate. Acephate is the chemical name for orthine. Acephate will actually somewhat keep thrips under control, but you have to spray it on a regular basis, and it stinks. So if you do have to use it, you can use it. Now to actually apply that stuff, I usually recommend a pump-up sprayer. Put a couple of drops of soap in there or spreader sticker. Everybody knows what a spreader sticker is?
No.
Spreader sticker, I'll explain it this way. When you take a shower, you wash your hair. If you don't rinse that shampoo out, you've got this sticky mess in your hair, right? Okay, the spreader sticker works on the same basis. When you put a spreader sticker in with your chemicals, whether it be a fungicide or a pesticide, it actually creates a film and it actually sticks to the plant. The other thing is it makes it it spread evenly over the surface tension of the plant, so it covers the entire plant. Anytime you use a pesticide or a fungicide, you should be using a spreader sticker. That makes it more effective, and it actually makes it work instead of just pouring it on the plant and having it drip off. It actually leaves a residue on the plant. So, and that also applies with your fertilizer. When you're feeding them, add some spreader sticker to it, and it will actually make the fertilizer stick to the plant. Yes, ma'am.
A spreader sticker, is that a product named spreader sticker?
It is a product. It is a product called spreader sticker.
Would soap do the same thing?
Bingo. Soap also does the same thing. Well, I don't know that I'd use ivory. I'd use something a little more gentle. Dawn does very well. I use Dawn because I use a lot of it. And that's the way I was taught by an orchid grower up in Orlando, is to always put soap in with my fertilizer or my insecticide or fungicide. Usually about a tablespoon to about 2 to 3 gallons. It's usually, I think the dosage rate they usually recommend is a teaspoon per gallon. Okay.
And you put that in with your fertilizer?
I put it in with fertilizer, fungicide, or insecticide, yes. Now the other thing too is if you're hesitant about using any insecticides, when you're fertilizing your orchids, that soapy water, any soft-bodied insect like aphids, the juvenile scales, it will kill them on contact. How many of you know Dawn dishwashing detergent kills fleas on contact? It is wonderful as a dog bath. I have a Great Pyrenees. Her coat is about 6 inches thick. And let me tell you, the only thing I found that kills fleas in her undercoat is Dawn. I've tried everything else, nothing works. Dawn kills them dead instantly. What I want to do is show you guys how to repot the different types of orchids. And I'm probably going to pick on one of you or two of you. And we'll show you guys how to repot. I'm not going to just do it. I'm going to have somebody come up. We're going to explain it and show you and walk you through it. This is a hands-on class. It's not just me up here talking. So, who has Cataleyas at home? Come on up. What's your name?
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy. Come on back and we're going to show you how to repot a Cataleya. Now, Dan and Tina have some orchids that are back in their hospital area, and they have a couple that need some repotting, so we pulled them as an example. Anytime you go to repot an orchid, the first thing you want to do is usually wet it down, get the roots wet, and actually let them loosen up. So when you go to pull it out of the pot, the roots don't stick to the side. They'll usually release. Thank you. They'll usually release, and you can pull the plant back out of the pot. If it's a clay pot and it's grown all over the clay pot, sometimes, if it's a smaller pot, you could just bust the pot up, peel the pot away, and then, pull the plant out and clean the roots off. So what I'm going to have you do is take this out of that pot.
So I want to wet
Just
it?
no,
No.
don't worry about it this time. Just pull it out. Okay. Now, pull it out over here.
And clean it up?
What I'd like you to do is go ahead and clean everything off the old roots. What you want to do is you want to take all the old potting material out of the plant, because after a period of time, it rots. And once it starts to break down and rot, you start losing the roots on the plant. And typically, if it's a bigger plant, this is also the time to divide it, clean it up, clean up the old dead rotted roots, and you want to get it ready to repot and put it into a new pot.
Do they go into shock like another plant would? Do they go into shock once you do that?
Yes, you never want to do it to a plant that's in spike or flowering. You want to wait till it's done flowering to repot it on the Cataleyas. Just about there. Notice anything about the roots?
Some of them have fallen off.
Yep. Some of the roots are falling off. The other thing is, when you look at roots on an orchid, the roots on an orchid should be white, like on the Vanda. See the big fleshy white roots? That's what healthy roots on an orchid should look like. Okay. This thing has been in a pot. The old roots are pretty much shot. So most of that needs to be cleaned off. That's not going to kill the plant. What you're going to do is you're going to stimulate it to put out new roots. So when you put it in a pot, it will regrow real quick. Yes, sir?
How do you get the roots to release when you're using those wooden slatted type?
That's tough. With the wooden slat baskets, how do you get the roots to release? You don't. Sometimes you just have to go through and cut them and pull the plant out. With Vandas, I tend to, if I have to take a Vanda out of a basket, I destroy the basket and peel it out piece by piece. If it's one of those little square plastic baskets that they start them out in, I'll cut the basket away and leave as many roots intact as possible. Okay? Great. Good job.
Thank you.
Now, everybody knows that orchids, how many of you think, let me see how I can word this. How long do you guys think an orchid lives?
Years and years.
How many years and years? 50, 60,
70.
70 maybe? Okay. If you look at this plant, they grow in kind of like a daisy chain. Can I get you to hold this up?
Sure.
And I'll show? As they grow, hold it just like that. As they grow, there's a front side and a back side to an orchid. On every orchid, it doesn't matter what kind of orchid it is. The back side of the orchid is the old growth. The front side of the orchid is the new growth. And the new growth you're going to usually be able to tell because it still usually has the white paper on it. Or that paper is usually still green as it's growing. Now, on an orchid, when you do repotting, the old back side of the orchid, you want to take that off. If it doesn't have a leaf on it, clean it up. Everybody knows what a pseudobulb is? No? Pseudobulb means false bulb, like an onion or a tulip. The stem on the orchid from the leaves to this part is called the pseudobulb. All right? These actually store food and water for the plant, so they keep the plant happy in between watering. All right? Any orchid that has a pseudobulb likes to dry out in between watering, so don't keep it wet all the time. Let it dry out a little bit. Now, when it's time to repot these guys and you want to clean them up and you want to put them in a new pot, there are a couple of tips that you want to do when you're doing this. Anytime you use any kind of a cutting tool, you want to sterilize it. Whether it be your garden clippers at home or if you've got a dedicated pair of shears that you use to do your repotting, before you start working on a plant, you want to go through and sterilize it. You can do it with alcohol, you can do it with bleach and water, but the clippers need to sit in there for at least 20 to 30 minutes before they're sterile. Now, with a plumber's torch like this, you saw how easy it is. I'm going to set this thing down for a second so I can talk to you guys. So if I'm not loud enough, I'll try and yell. When you go to use this, all you have to do is just turn the valve on, click the button, and you've got a flame. Very easy to use. If you're an avid orchid grower, I would suggest that you pick up one of these. The reason being is if you trim an orchid that you're cleaning up and you haven't sterilized these clippers before you've used them from a previous orchid, if that previous orchid has an issue, you're now going to transfer it to this orchid. So every time you sterilize or every time you repot, you want to make sure that you're your tools are clean. Now, it's not just disease problem. They're finding out in the orchid world that orchid viruses are a real big problem because a lot of the old orchid growers did not do this. And you'd be surprised how many orchids typically are virused. Now, because this is hot, I'm gonna do this for you. When you repot an orchid, when you divide, if you're gonna divide it, you wanna make sure that you have at least 4 good, strong, healthy pseudobulbs. Now, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pseudobulbs on there. 2 of the pseudobulbs in the back don't have leaves on them. They're actually not doing anything for the plant, so you want to clip them off and take them off. Now, see if I real quick. All you want to do is go back in between the last pseudobulb that has a leaf and the next pseudobulb back, and a simple clip. Easy?
Easy.
Easy peasy. Now, when you're looking at the orchid too, when you divide it, look at that cut. You want to make sure that there's not like a purple ring around the inside of that white tissue. If there is, keep cutting up until that tissue is clean and white. Now, where is it? Pardon me? Yeah. When you divide these, and I'll come across the way for you guys. When you divide these, you want to look at this cut. Make sure that there's not a purple ring on there. If there is a purple ring, cut forward on the plant until you get rid of that purple ring. But try and leave as many pseudobulbs on a plant if you have to.
Okay,
Now,
the part you just cut off, are you going to replant that and make
No.
another plant out of that?
that's done.
That's dead.
That's dead.
Oh, okay.
The back half of that, you know, sometimes you can get a plant when you divide it. If you've got an old pseudobulb like that, you can stand it up in a pot, leave it in a pot, and eventually one of the back eyes might wake up and start growing again. You can start a plant like that, but those are so small, it didn't look like they had a decent eye on them. And an eye is where your new growth is going to come from, and it's going to come from this little bump right down here at the bottom of the plant. Right now it's covered in that white paper. That white paper, eventually you'll see it swell, and then that green growth will start. And most of the orchids right now are just coming into their peak growing period. So you're going to see that a lot of them start waking up and you're going to start seeing new growth. Now, how many of you have cinnamon at home? Yep. Everybody has cinnamon at home. Cinnamon is actually a bark. It is wonderful. So when you go to divide your orchid, it's antifungal, it's antibacterial. So when you go to divide your orchids and you make a cut on it, just simply put a little cinnamon on it and it seals that wound so disease and pests don't get into the orchid. Easy tip. That's an old school trick. Not a lot of people will tell you about that still. But some of the old orchid growers used to do that. I still do it on my plants at home. And it's just an easy way to seal that up and get it sterile and cleaned up. Now, repotting. Repotting is always fun. Like I said, there's a front and a back to an orchid. The back's the backside, the old growth. The front's the new growth in the front. Now, Cataleyas are only going to bloom off of new growth. They're not going to bloom on the old growth. So you want the new growth. Now, grab this clay pot and grab this clay pot. Now, if I was going to repot, which pot would I use?
The big one.
Okay, let's do this. Raise your hand if you think the small one. Okay, put your hands down. Raise your hand if you think it's the big one. All of you with your hands up now, you're wrong. Orchids don't like to be over-potted. Now, they like to be a little bit root bound, so they like to be tight in a pot. They don't like to have a lot of room to wiggle around, and that's just too big for that right now. Okay, so you wouldn't want to use this pot. Even though you want it to get that big, it's still too early to put it into this size pot. So typically what you want to do is you want to find an orchid where it sits down in it and still has some room to grow in to the pot. See?
Yep.
All right. Now, when you go to repot it, this is where I put you to work.
Okay.
Bring it in, the front and back of the orchid. If you put, yes ma'am. I'm not sure if Dan and Tina are carrying them, and I don't see anybody from Busy Bee here. Lowe's, Home Depot carries, Lowe's and Home Depot. Online, locally, Lowe's and Home Depot are the easiest source. At the Vero Orchid Show, there will be an orchid supply grower or an orchid supply person there that will carry all that stuff. Yes. Somebody had a question? Oh, where do you find the clay pots these days? Home Depot and Lowe's. It's getting harder and harder to find them. The big 10-inch, 12-inch pots like this anymore, they don't make them anymore. You can't find them. If you've got them, hold on to them. They're gold. So I went to McKee Jungle Gardens to help the girl that's redoing the orchids there, and I looked at the side of their greenhouse, and they had 2 pallets full of those things. You should see my eyes glaze over.
If you have old clay pots kind of stacked in the garage or something, like I think a lot of us do, is there any process you need to go through before you replant something?
Yes. If you've got old pots, say if you've got a plant that you're pulling out of a clay pot, before you use it on a new pot or plant, it needs to be disinfected and cleaned. So what I usually recommend is soak them in bleach and water for 24 hours, scrub them, soak them in bleach and water again, and then soak them in clear water for a day. So it's one day, soak them in bleach and water, take them out, scrub them, put them in new bleach and water the next day, take them out. The next day you put them in just fresh water, let them soak the fresh water up. Yeah, it can be. I mean, you can cheat. You can take it and soak it in water, bleach water, scrub it, rinse it off, and set it out. But I'm a little impulsive about, or not impulsive, but I'm OCD on it. I like to make sure that I've got it thoroughly clean. I do an extra step at home. Once I've got it out of the clean water and it's dried out, I turn my oven on 400 and it goes in the oven for 400 for 2 hours. I sterilize that pot again. Yes, ma'am.
And you put them in a dishwasher.
You can. I don't think it gets hot enough to really sterilize it. And it doesn't really, it will sterilize your plates, but I don't think it will sterilize it enough for the bacteria or virus with orchids. No, don't put it in the microwave. Not good. That's not good. It'll explode. If there's any moisture in that clay pot, it will explode. It won't be pretty. And that's the same thing with the oven. If you put them in the oven and there's any moisture left in that pot, they could explode. And when you do put them in the oven, if you're going to cook them and sterilize them in the oven, turn the oven off once you're done and let it cool down naturally and slowly. Just don't pull them out hot, because they could explode too. Yes, ma'am.
Do you recommend the bleach on new pots also?
No, unless, you know, she asked if I recommend bleaching new pots. Typically when you're buying them from the store and they're new, they don't have any pathogens from other plants on them. So I typically don't. I guess if I was really OCD, I probably would, but I'm lazy. You know, when you have 400 orchids at home, you want to try and go as fast as possible. I don't do that when they're brand new, but if they're used, yes, I do. All right, now, front and back of an orchid. When you put an orchid in the pot, if you put this orchid in the middle, what's going to happen? The new growth is going to grow out, and it's going to grow back out of the pot almost immediately. So when you put the orchid in the pot, you want to take the back side of the orchid and put it back against the edge of the pot. You want that plant to grow into that pot so that it doesn't outgrow the pot within one season. Typically, repotting, you really should be doing it with regular orchid bark about every 2 years here in Florida. That stuff starts to break down and decompose within about 2 years, if not sooner, because of our heat and humidity, all right? So you put it in like that.
Yeah, do I put bark in first?
Nope,
Or no?
you can put it in just like that.
Okay.
Now, you know, normally orchids will grow flat like that, and the pseudobulb, you know, the modified stem, the rhizome, will grow flat, and the pseudobulbs will stand up. But every once in a while you get one that's growing vertically like this. Don't be afraid of potting that. Just take it, the back side of the plant goes down in there, and then you just fill in with orchid bark. You want the front end to be above or just at the very surface of the orchid bark when you put the bark in there. Go ahead, fill it in and just jam it in there. When you repot them, when you're putting the orchid bark back into the pots, you want to make sure that that orchid bark is in there, that you fill all the voids, that the plant is actually seated in there very tightly so that it doesn't wiggle. If the wind starts blowing and those leaves start to wiggle, when the new roots start to grow out, the roots will rub against the bark and it will kill the root tip, so it won't reattach in the pot.
Did you put anything in before the orchid bark? I missed.
Some people do. Some people put styrofoam peanuts. Some people don't. I don't have any peanuts here because I was scared they would blow all over everything, so I didn't bring any today. We're kind of cheating. You can put one layer of styrofoam peanuts in the bottom. What that does is it helps alleviate the water from pooling in on the roots. All right. It also helps you where you're not using as much orchid bark when you repot. Now, let me give you that for a second. Now see, she's got this potted in here. She's got it nice and tight. The plant doesn't really want to wiggle around. The new growth is right at the top, right at the surface, and it's seated in here and it's rooted in. Well, it's not rooted in, but it's seated and it's nice and tight in there, so it doesn't really wiggle around. There are some tricks and some tools that you can use to help make sure that that plant holds still when you do repot it. These are called orchid clips. These are what they call orchid rhizome clips. What they do is they actually go across the top of the plant and they hold the plant down into the pot. Now, I buy them where they're a little bit longer so that I can use them in big pots or smaller pots. So I just cut them down to the size of the pot that I need. When you go to put these in, the back part goes over the edge of the pot. Sometimes you have to kind of squeeze it in and tighten it up a little bit so that it actually holds onto the pot. What's supposed to happen is this back end of the wire is supposed to grab onto the side of the pot. So when you go to put it in, I usually go on the back side of the pot, go in across the top of the pseudobulb, just like this. Push it in and push it down, and it actually will hold that pot in there. I can wiggle it. That plant's not going anywhere. Okay? Good job.
Thank you.
You did it perfect.
Thank you.
Absolutely perfect. That was wonderful. All right. Now, I told you guys about sunburn. This plant has a little spot of sunburn on it. You see the white spot on the leaf? That's what sunburn looks like after it's been burned. Now, Phalaenopsis. Everybody buys phales. They want to take them home. They want to put them into a decorator pot, and they want to make them look nice and pretty on the dining room table or the kitchen countertop. How many of you know that you can actually repot a Phalaenopsis while it's in spike? Nobody? You can actually repot a Phalaenopsis orchid while it's in spike or in flower. It won't set it back. Just be gentle with it. How many of you have phales at home? I'm looking for a victim. Raise your hands one more time. I heard that. Hi. What's your name? Hi, Sherry. Sherry, have you repotted phales before?
Yes.
Okay. Then you know what you're doing. Uh-oh. Okay. All right. When you repot phales, like I said, you can do them while they're in spike or in bloom, so it's not a real big issue. I'll let you go ahead and pull the plant out of the pot.
Want to peel all the stuff off it too?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, go ahead and peel it out here. We're going to let the old Spagna Moss go into the landscape. What she's doing is she's taking all that old Spagna Moss off of the root ball. With Spagna Moss in the state of Florida, with the humidity and the rain that we get, that Spagna Moss breaks down in a year. Spagna Moss should be redone every year, not every 2 years. Can you turn around for us a little bit? There we go. Now, what you're going to find when you start repotting phales is typically there's an outer layer of Spagna Moss. The growers, when they go to take them out of the initial little pots that they start them out in, has one little plug of Spagna Moss. When they go to repot, they take that plant out of the pot, they take another layer of Spagna Moss, they pack it around the initial root ball on the seedlings, and they just let it grow into that. What I want you to do when you repot these guys is clean all the old Spagna Moss off these things, because it will rot eventually, and that old Spagna Moss will rot the roots out on the phale. So you want to get rid of all that old material on it. Yes, ma'am?
How do you know whether to use Spagna Moss?
That's a good question. She asked, how do you know whether to use Spagna Moss or to use orchid bark? Where do you grow your orchids at? Inside the house? How many of you grow them out in the landscape? All right. The difference is this. When you're growing phales, and especially phales, if you're growing them outside, we don't really grow Cataleyas and Spagna Moss, so we're going to ignore the Cataleyas and the Vandas. Phales are pretty much the only ones that we really grow in Spagna Moss. If you're growing them inside or under a covered roof, you want to grow them in Spagna Moss and grow them in a plastic pot. If you're growing them out in the landscape, during the summer months here, we get afternoon rains every day. That plant will never, dry out a little bit. You don't want to grow it in Spagna Moss because that moss will stay wet and it'll rot the roots. Okay? How'd we do?
Well,
Did pretty good.
yeah.
What about the wood chips?
The bark?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can use bark on Phalaenopsis if you're growing them out in the landscape. Grow them in baskets or grow them in pots, but just grow them, if you're going to grow them out where they get rained on, grow them with bark.
That's what I grow mine in.
There's just a little bit left in there. You've got most of it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, they did bring me a couple of pots. Where'd I put them? Okay.
Okay, we're going to put this in the center of the pot.
Right. Now, I want to give you a tip. Let me, and I'm going to put this down for a second. When you grow phales real quick, the phale root system is a little bit different than on a Cataleya. The phale root system grows from the bottom of the plant and it grows out like a spider. When you're repotting phales, what you want to do is you want to get a little bit of moss to put up underneath the roots to support those roots.
Oh, gee, I've never done that.
Easy trick to do. Just take a little bit of moss, just like a little ball.
Even if you're growing them outside?
Well, no, if you're growing them outside, use bark, but set the roots down in and fill in with bark.
Okay.
But
grow
with
mine outside.
fails with sphagnum moss, see how I'm kind of cradling the roots over the top of that sphagnum moss? Then what you want to do is wrap the roots down around that little ball of sphagnum moss. Then you want to cover the outside of those roots now with sphagnum moss. Be generous. Don't hold back. I've been in Apopka where you see the orchid nurseries and they've got, 10 or 12 ladies back in potting stations up and down the aisles of the orchid house, and they've got these big tables and it's just, overflowing with wet sphagnum moss. And they'll take, pots of these things in an assembly line, and they'll just take them in, pop them in there, and just slap it on there and stuff it in the pot. And they're done like that.
That's for inside the house, but
Yeah.
outside I put in.
Yeah. Go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, see, that's why I never use sphagnum moss.
Yes. When you use sphagnum moss, it comes to you like this, dry. You need to take this, take it out, put it in a bucket like this, and fill it with water, let it soak up the water, and it's going to fluff up. Perfect. Now, you should be able to just stuff that down into the pot. See how she's got a big mound of moss around the outside of that?
It's going to need more moss to hold it in the
That's
pot.
okay, just tuck a little bit in there. Don't cram it down though. When you're repotting, you want that moss to be firm, not compacted in there. You want it to be a little bit light and loose, but you want that orchid to sit in there firmly. You don't want it to move around a lot.
But aren't the roots supposed to get air?
Yeah, that's why you don't pack.
Oh, okay.
If you pack it real tight and really jam it in there, you don't get enough airspace in between the roots. How do we do? Perfect. Okay. Now she's got this in here. It's nice. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed you're putting that in a plastic pot and not an orchid pot. When should you use just plastic, and when should you use something with all the holes in the side?
With Phalaenopsis, because they don't have pseudobulbs, they can't store food and water. They need to be watered on a regular basis. If you're growing them inside, you want them to retain as much moisture as possible. So I recommend going into a plastic pot. If you're growing outside in the landscape, you want to put orchids in a clay pot or a basket so that the water actually drains off. Like during the summer when we have those torrential rains, you want to make sure that they have a chance to drain off and dry out a little bit. Very good. She did a great job. Now that orchid is now repotted, and it's ready to go for the next bloom season. Now the thing with Phalaenopsis, everybody gets a phale. What do you do with it once it's like this? Doesn't have any flowers on it. Who knows what to do with it? Cut it off? Louder. Leave it alone. Why? Right, but there's a trick to that. Some Phalaenopsis species will put a kiki off on the end. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. If it's a smaller plant and you're just repotting it and you want that plant to get a little bit bigger, I recommend cutting the flower spike off, let that plant rest, let it build itself up for the next season so that when the next bloom comes around the following year, that's a bigger, stronger plant, so you get bigger, stronger flower spikes and flowers. And sometimes you'll get double spikes on them too. So I usually on a small plant will recommend cutting it off. On a plant that's good sized, that has decent roots on it, that I've just repotted and I want to clean that up, I will go through and I'll cut it back above the second node. If you look on a Phalaenopsis flower spike, there's a ring every 2 or 3 inches on the flower spike. Those are called the nodes on the flower spike. Usually what I'll recommend is going back through, count up from the bottom, and there's one down at the bottom, there's another one here. I usually start at the one that's just above the plant and count up 2, and I'll cut it off right there. At this time of year, we're still getting cool at night. If you set this back outside later on, after you've repotted it, sometimes it will initiate a secondary flower spike. So you can sometimes trick it into getting another bloom out of it, okay? Yes, ma'am?
Would that also work if you bought it in the supermarket, it bloomed, the blooms all died, you didn't repot it, everything looks great.
Yes.
Do you still do the same thing?
Yes, if you buy it and you take it home, it's bloomed out, you didn't repot it, you can do that also. You can actually help them to initiate a flower spike. You just need to make sure that they're cooling down every evening for about 3 weeks so that they initiate that flower spike. Somebody over here had a question? When you go to cut it, and I'm going to do it on this one just to show you guys how to do it. Like I said, always use a sterilized tool. And you had a question back there? She asked me, she's told me that she's growing her orchids under cover. They don't get rained on at all, do they? Okay, they're not getting rained on, and she's growing in clay pots and in bark. You can do that. I'm not telling you you can't. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. I'll be honest with you. You can talk to 5 different orchid growers, and they're all going to tell you something different. Try and find, my recommendation for that is try and find somebody that you see what they're doing and they're growing well, and if they're in your area, try and stick to their ideas. For those of you that want a hands-on, get a hold of her. I kill fail, so I'll tell you, I'm honest about that. You can do that, but with bark and clay pots, you need to realize that those roots are going to dry out a lot faster, so you may need to water a little bit more frequently. With moss, when you put that plant in the sink and you water it, you fill the pot up, let it soak up all that water, let it sit there for a couple of minutes, fill the pot up again, let it drain out, and then put it back where you're going to keep it as a decorative item. All right. Now I've sterilized my tools. Count up from the second node. Make a simple clip. And what else do we do? Seal that wound. Put a little bit of cinnamon on that. And that just seals it up, and it's done. Now, if you put that back out, it gets exposed to cold water every evening. It should respike. This time of year, with our weather pattern, I'm expecting it to put out a secondary spike. Yes, sir.
Okay, us ones that all ours are on trees or on boards, propping up philodendrons, things like that. What do we do about repotting them? Do we? We get rid of
You don't. If they're actually attached to the tree, just leave them alone. Let Mother Nature take care of them. You don't have to do. Once they get to a certain size, what he asks is if you're attaching them out in the landscape, what do you do about repotting them? Then you actually don't have to. That orchid will grow and continue to grow and grow and grow. Remember, I asked you guys a question. I'll get to you in just a second. I asked you guys, how long an orchid will live. Like I've said, we've got two really big orchids here in Indian River County that I know that the plants have been on those trees for 60 years, close to 60 years. So they'll go a long time. An orchid will continue to grow and grow and grow and grow and be alive for a long time. I've got something that I brought in from my collection. I was lucky enough to help a friend here locally that had a greenhouse that had a really nice collection from a gentleman up in Melbourne. The gentleman's name up in Melbourne is Joe Grisaffi. Joe has probably hybridized more orchids than anybody in the state of Florida, and probably most of the United States. Joe's a phenomenal orchid grower. But Joe, back in his early days, went to an orchid show and bought an orchid from a vendor. I think he said he paid $600 for it. Now that plant was Cataleya I'm going to call it Ludiminiana. The name for it back in the early days was Speciosum. No, Specioissima was the name. Really weird name. But this is actually that orchid. It's Cataleya Ludiminiana. This plant, this is a piece of the original plant that was awarded in 1901. It was awarded by the Royal Horticultural Society in England. The plant was first discovered, I think, in 1854, and this plant is that old. It's just a piece of it. So it's really, you know, this is a small back bulb division that I was lucky enough to be given as you know, a favor. I'm lucky to get it. It's probably one of the more exclusive orchids I've got in my collection. And I'm lucky to have that, but that's, you know, I brought it because of its age. It doesn't look all that great right now. When I got it, it only had 3 pseudobulbs on it. So it's slowly starting to get there. In the next couple of years, I expect it to look a lot better. So it's been potted now for about 2 years now. No, about a year, I'm sorry, about a year. So that's something neat, and it's one of those heritage orchids that you just don't see very often. John Odom down in Fort Pierce has some that he has in the collection that are, you know, brother and sister to this one. So they're all from the same plant, from Joe. Vandas. Let's talk about Vandas. How many of you are growing a Vanda? Okay. How often do you water your Vandas? Be loud. Exactly, not enough. I heard that. Who was that? You're very wise with Vandas. Vandas like a lot of water. You know, sometimes during the heat of the summer, they like water twice a year. On a Vanda, when you're growing them, the more roots you have on that plant, the happier the plant's going to be, the more flowers you're going to get, and the bigger the plant is going to get when it grows. So, twice a day. Did I say twice a year? Yeah. Oh, okay. You got me. With Vandas, you can see the roots on these. They've wrapped the roots up in a circle. This was growing in a different pot. They've wrapped the roots into a circle and stuffed it down into the basket. What's going to happen with this plant as time goes on, you're going to see the roots start hanging down, and you'll get a bunch of roots on the bottom. Like I said, the more roots you have, the bigger the plant's going to be, the more flowers you're going to get, and the bigger the flowers are going to get. Now, these plants, if you're growing Vandas, are fertilizer hogs. They love to be fed. They like a lot of food. They also like to be watered daily, if not during the heat of the summer, twice a day. The only thing with watering them twice a day, during the later part of the day, only water the roots, not the whole plant. So in the morning, you can get the whole thing wet. In the afternoon, just get the roots wet. Okay? Now, let's talk about feeding orchids. How many of you feed your orchids once a week? Raise your hands. How many of you feed once every 2 weeks? Once every month? Come on, you guys. Once every 2 months? 3 months? All right. It's not going to grow if you don't feed it. You got to feed it. The reason being is the orchid potting material is only there to hold it in place. It doesn't give that plant any nutritional value at all. It doesn't give it any food. Now, the orchids that are in the landscape, the neat thing about the orchids in the landscape, once they get on a tree, the roots will spread all over the tree, and you'll start getting insects, leaf detritus, dirt, dust, bird poop. You'll get all kinds of stuff on the roots. So it will start decomposing and feed the roots on an orchid in the landscape. But if you're growing in a pot, it's not getting any food. So what you're going to see with a plant is if you're not fertilizing it enough, is the top will keep growing, especially on a Vanda, but you'll find the lower leaves will turn yellow and they'll fall off. So you have to feed them. Now, what fertilizer do I recommend? The fertilizer you actually put on them. Better Grow actually makes two very nice formulas. One is a growth formula, and that's your Orchid Plus. It's going to give you everything it needs to produce new growth, and that's your first number, the 20. The 14 is going to help you with flowering. The 13 is going to help you with root growth. All right? Now, the other fertilizer that they have is a bloom booster. Everybody knows what the middle number is? It's not nitrogen. Yes?
It has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It's a combination of all three elements.
Right. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. NPK. Okay? Now that middle number, the phosphorus, we live in Indian River County, and unfortunately we have a river with a problem, and our waterway is a problem, and it's from phosphorus in fertilizers. There are some fertilizer products out there that don't have phosphorus in them that you can use, but you have to know where to go to get them. I don't think there's anybody locally that sells them. The orchid supply dealer that will come to the Vero Beach Orchid Show at the end of April will have it, and it's called a CalMag fertilizer, CAL-MAG, and it doesn't have the phosphorus in it. So it's actually probably one of the better fertilizers. Now the head grower for Better Grow is Rob Palmer, and Rob has a greenhouse over in Mayaca City, over towards Sarasota, that area. He's now producing a fertilizer that is CalMag that also has seaweed in it, kelp, that he sells, himself as his own product, and that's what I'm using at home. I don't play around with the other stuff. I use a balanced fertilizer with a couple of extra goodies in it. Yes.
When do you use the green and the pink together? Do you use them both together or what?
No, you don't use them together. You use them separately.
Okay, at the same when you do one, you do the other also?
No.
Or?
When you use these two fertilizers, use the green bag. Say if you water once a week, use the green bag. Say we have 4 weeks in a month. 3 weeks, you're using this. 1 week in the month, you're using this. Okay? Now, when you mix this up, remember to put a little bit of soap in there too, so it actually sticks to the plant.
I don't mix it together, but I spray one and then I got the other and I spray it again with the other one.
Nope. Always use them separately. Don't use them together. I have a gentleman out on the barrier island that started with the Orchid Society. He lived in Grand Harbor in a condo. Had his orchid collection hanging from ligustrums out in front of the condo. In pots, they all look presentable. They all look nice and clean and pretty. His neighbors didn't like them. They didn't like looking at the pots. They just thought it was ugly. So he bought a house. When he bought the house, we ended up, his initial collection was 800 orchids. We ended up putting them all out in the landscape. Once he bought the house, he bought a house with 3 or 4 oak trees on the property. Those oak trees are covered from top to bottom now. Even some of the palm trees are just covered. The last time we stopped counting how many orchids he had put in the landscape at 3,500. And the Robelinis he's got on the side yard, we've put the little miniature Phalaenopsis all up and down the Robelinis, and when they come into bloom, they're absolutely spectacular.
Is it just nature taking care of it?
Nature taking care of themselves. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sure when you have a cold snap, low blooms, how you protect in the landscape. How do you protect the plant?
That depends. once they're in the landscape and they're on the trees, what will happen is the canopy will protect them from frost. If we're going to go down below 50 and we're going to go towards a really hard frost or a freeze, all bets are off. You'd be surprised at how well they will acclimate on the tree and hold up against weather like that, even a hurricane. They'll hold on. After the hurricane, you need to spray them with a disinfectant or fungicide to stop, any cuts or wounds from stuff flying into them. But they'll actually do really well out in the landscape. There's something about putting them on a tree insulates them against the cold. Now, if you were to take a pot, an orchid in a pot and hang it from the tree, probably if we had a really hard freeze, it would die, while the plant sitting next to it that's attached to the tree would live without a problem. It's just bizarre to watch. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. At what temperature outdoor orchids that are hanging from trees, when do you start fertilizing them? Is it too early right now?
No. Orchids are growing year-round. Now, they're not putting on new actual growth this time of year. They slow down, especially on the Cataleyas. But the roots are still growing. And right now you're coming into the main bloom period for most of the Cataleyas. So they're still wanting food. They're still absorbing it. So they still need that energy to put out the flowers. She asked me, when do you start fertilizing orchids? And there's an exception to this rule too, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. And we don't have any. How many were at Garden Fest again? Everybody saw the orchids that stood straight up and down and had flowers all up and down the canes. They're Dendrobium nobiles. That's an orchid that you do not fertilize from October until it's in bloom. And that's usually about now they're all starting to bud out and bloom on the Dendrobium nobiles.
What about the phals?
Phales, I fertilize them all year round. I never stop, ever. I don't ever stop on the Cataleyas, the Vandas, Dendrobiums. I never stop fertilizing them. I'm always fertilizing them. Now at home, I have a system at home that my sprinkler system has what's called a fertilizer injector, so that every time that they get water, that fertilizer injector is injecting a concentrate into that water stream, and it mixes in and gets put on my orchids all the time. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the Vandas. I'm new to this, and I just bought one at one of the box stores where the roots were hanging down, and that's how I have it on my lanai. And so I just spray with this bottle orchid fertilizer, the roots and the leaves. Do I have to put it in a basket like that?
You don't. What's it in right now? Is it just hanging from a wire, or? Yeah. You can leave it like that. Some people like to put it in a basket because it's more decorative looking. All the basket does, or a pot with a Vanda orchid, is it holds the plant. It doesn't do anything for it, but it just holds it. Just gives it a presentation. And I've seen growers just grow them from just a wire with the roots hanging down. That's it. So you can do either or. Yes, ma'am.
My question on the outside growth when you put them on trees, because I have a lot of oak trees, is it detrimental to the tree itself?
No. Orchids are epiphytic. They're not parasitic. So what an orchid is doing is, once the roots attach to the tree, they're just looking for a foothold. They just want to hold on to something. They're not actively taking anything away from the trees. They're not sucking any energy or food off of the tree. I've got 3 of you. I'm going to start here and we'll work our way forward. Yes, ma'am.
Can you put an orchid on any tree, or is it specific trees only?
You can put an orchid on just about any tree, but I wouldn't try it on like a gumbo limbo, anything with exfoliating bark, because what will happen is the roots will attach, the bark will exfoliate, and it'll fall off. Now, if you're doing it on palm trees, everybody knows cabbage palms. All right, you see the boots hanging on the cabbage palms. A lot of people like to take their orchids and tuck them into the boot. The problem with that is, once the orchid gets really big, the boots fall off. The orchid falls off. So if you're going to put them on palms, make sure that you clean the boots off and attach it to the palm tree itself directly. You know, on some of the bigger orchids, like bigger oncidiums and some of the brassias and stuff that can get like really big, I had a lady come in one time and bring me a big oncidium that had been on a palm tree. She put it up on the boots, and eventually the orchid got so big that it just peeled the boots right off the tree. She brought it in to me. I had to divide it up and clean it up. So what I recommend with palm trees is just clean off the boots and then attach it. Now you can attach it to palm trees, oak trees, royal poincianas, I mean just about anything that you want to. Cedar trees also. Any kind of pine tree, orchid bark. Orchid bark is actually a type of pine bark, so they'll grow really well on orchid or on pine bark too. Just watch out for the sap on the longleaf pines. It's just nasty. Yes, ma'am.
How do you attach them, and how long does it take for the roots to reach?
From say like March on, the roots are going to attach really quickly as long as you're watering it on a regular basis. It doesn't take long. It takes usually about 2 to 3, 4 months, and the roots will attach. I usually leave what I'm using to attach it to the tree on there for at least 6 months to a year. Once the orchid is fully attached to the tree, I'll go back, and if I'm using tie tape, stretch tape, I call it green stretch tape. On palm trees, I use this because I can wrap it around the tree and tie the orchid on. Once the orchid is attached, you can go back through and cut this and then wet it down and then go through and just thread it out from underneath the roots. It'll pull right out and leave the roots intact without, you know, pulling them back off the tree. I use a lot of this. And there was somebody else here that had a question. Yes, ma'am.
That's what I was going to ask you is, how do you get them started on a tree?
I tie them on front and back on the orchid. The back goes down, the front goes up, and I tie them on with green stretch tape, and I hold that orchid on there so it doesn't wiggle. If it wiggles, remember when a root tip is starting to grow, if that root tip starts to grow on and all of a sudden that root tip starts to wiggle a little bit, that tip dies, so it won't attach. You've got to have that new green tip on the root to actually get it to actually attach. Okay? Any more questions? Yes?
If I have one potted right now in the house and it's blooming and beautiful, you recommend doing that now or waiting until it loses its...
Is it a Phalaenopsis? You could do it now, but keep it in the house while it's blooming. Once it's done blooming, put it outside. Just remember, Phalaenopsis do not want full sun. Make sure it has a canopy around it or over it so it's shaded during the day. I had somebody over here first. Yes, ma'am.
Are you talking about attaching Vandas to the tree?
Vandas, Cataleyas, Phales, Dendrobiums, just about any kind of orchid. Remember, orchids are epiphytic or lithophytic, I think, where they grow on rocks. Typically in the wild, you know, most orchids are growing on trees or rocks or a stump. We're the idiots that put them in pots. Thank God we do it, because otherwise we wouldn't have them. How many?
How would you do that on a rock?
They grow naturally on the rock down in South America. And what happens is the roots will actually grow into cracks and crevices where all the detritus falls in, and it creates like a real rich humus down around them. And you'll find all kinds of Cataleya species actually growing in full sun on rock faces. It's, you know, you'd be surprised at how many of them will actually take full sun. So you just remember you have to ease them into it. Yes, ma'am.
What medium do you use for epidendrums?
Epidendrums, Cataleyas, any Cataleya or bark mix. Oh, the Radicans. Ah, you're talking about something totally different. Busy Bee does have Epiderm Radicans, the little orange terrestrial ground orchids. I grow them in the ground with a real thick layer of cypress mulch. I just mulch in real hard around them. I use potting soil on the bottom, but I put a real thick, you know, bed of mulch in there. Okay. Full sun on the epidendrums. On the epis, yes, full sun. I've got a client out on the island that has 2 banks of them on each side of the driveway as you pull in the driveway that are probably about 3 feet wide by about 8 feet to 10 feet long. They're beautiful when they grow in like that. If you're going to put them out in the landscape, if you're just starting, always remember that that morning sun is not as strong and as intense. A lot of orchids can handle that eastern morning sunlight. Even some phales will handle eastern morning sunlight, but it's that middle of the day to middle of afternoon western sun that will absolutely fry an orchid here in Florida. Okay? Somebody else had a question? Yes, ma'am?
Watering indoor orchids, watering indoor orchids, is it okay to let them sit in the water, or should you just let the water run right through them?
Okay. How many orchids do you have?
I have 3.
3? She just asked a question, and this is a really important question. Do you mix up water and fertilizer in a bucket and then just put each one in there?
No. I generally put them in, because they're small, put them a dish underneath them and pour the water.
Water them separately, each one? Okay. Yeah, you can just water them separately like that. How many of you have done the trick where you mix up a bucket of orchid fertilizer, stick the orchid down in it, pull it out, put the next one in there, and then put the next one in there? Don't do that. Ever don't do that. Here's the reason behind that is if the first orchid that you have that you mix up a batch of water and fertilizer and you go to put your first orchid in there, if that orchid has a problem, every orchid that you put in that mix after that now has that problem. You gave it cooties. So, when you fertilize and water, I usually recommend, just a pump-up sprayer or a hose-in sprayer, like something like this that you can put the fertilizer in and actually hook it to the hose and just go through and spray them. How many of you have a Miracle Grow hose-in sprayer at home? I use that too. My number one tool is a little pump-up sprayer, and I've got it back there because the pump is pretty loud. I have a pump-up sprayer that I go through, I mix up my fertilizer, and I'll go through and just water everybody real well, and I don't want to get any of the electrical equipment wet, so can I get somebody to be what I usually do, especially with Vandas, is I'll go through with them and I'll go through and I'll wet them, and what you'll see, I may get some of you in the front row wet, is I'll go through and I'll water the fertilizer, or I'll fertilize the roots. When you water an orchid or you fertilize it, you can spray the foliage. The foliage doesn't readily absorb most of the fertilizer. Where the fertilizer is getting taken up into the plant is through the roots. Now with Vandas, once you get them wet, you can see they're going from white to green. That's what you want with a Vanda. You want those roots to turn nice and green when you water them. These things turn green right away, so that's perfect. Okay, yes?
What about slow release?
You can use slow release. When I'm repotting, typically I'll put a slow release on top of the pot so that every time they get watered, they get a little bit of fertilizer every time they get watered. If you're lazy and you're not fertilizing, you can get a slow release dynamite. Do not use Osmocote. Osmocote will burn the roots on an orchid. Use dynamite, which is the silver slow release pellet, and put like a tablespoon per 6-inch pot on each plant if you're not fertilizing. How many of you go away for the summer? All right. if you don't have somebody taking care of your orchids, who's feeding them? On Vandas or on all of them? You can do that. The slow release doesn't hurt anything. You can actually apply it directly to the top of the plant, above the roots, right around the base of the plant. And it will, you know, as it gets watered each time, will release a little bit of fertilizer. If it's a Vanda, you can make up a little nylon stocking with about a tablespoon of the slow release fertilizer in a little satchel and just hang it up on the plant above the roots. And every time it gets wet or rained on, it will release fertilizer down to the roots. So that's a good way to take care of them if you go away for the summer. For those of you that go away for the summer, shame on you, stay here. It just turns into Hades during June and July. The last couple of years, June and July have probably been hotter than August and September. It's been unreal the last couple of years. Let's see, does anybody else have any questions? No. Like I said, it doesn't matter what brand of orchid fertilizer you're using, just as long as you're putting fertilizer on them. Water them first and then spray them down with a fertilizer. You can do that. We're finding out there was a gentleman that came to talk to the Vero Beach Orchid Society that we had a discussion about when you're fertilizing orchids, do you water them first so that you actually get the roots primed so that they actually start taking up nutrients? There's a discussion going on in the orchid world right now whether or not that's necessary. People used to tell you that if you go through and the roots are dry and you just put fertilizer on them, you burn the roots. That doesn't happen to orchids in the landscape or out in the wild. Nobody comes through and waters them before they get fertilized. So the discussion is you don't really need to do that. That's old school. All the old time orchid growers will tell you to do that. The problem with that is this, is once the roots start to turn green and they're saturated, they've taken up everything they're going to take up. So they're not going to take up anything more. So if you go through and water it first, it's already taken up what it's going to take up. It's not going to take up anymore, so it's going to drop off. So what we're trying to figure out, and like I said, I mean, you'll get 5 different people who will tell you 5 different things. But this is something new that's come up, and if you look at the Insecticide tempensis that usually grows, the little native butterfly orchid that grows on the oak trees everywhere here in this area, nobody goes through and fertilizes them or waters them before they get food. They just, when they get rained on, that's it. And they take up everything right when they first get rained on. So the debate is still, I mean, it's kind of funny right now, but if you think about it logically, I mean, it makes sense. It really does. Somebody else had a question.
I'm new to the area and I bought one at the grocery store and it said put 3 ice cubes.
I was wondering when somebody was going to say put ice cubes on your orchids. How many of you do that? Raise your hands nice and high. Don't do that. All right. Say it's February and you've got a swimming pool in the backyard. That water is, what, 50 degrees? Do you like it when you jump in that water? Neither does the orchid. You have to remember orchids are subtropical. They don't like cold, typically. Ice cubes, that water is at freezing when it melts. So it's right about, what, 32 to 38 degrees when it's melting? Yeah, don't do that. If you're going to water your orchids, water them heavily, water them thoroughly. Wait a couple of minutes, go back and water them again, and then let them dry out a little bit in between watering. If you're putting ice cubes on them, you're stunting the orchid and slowing it down. Don't do that. Yes, ma'am.
What is your vessel of choice for planting orchids? I know there's all different
Some people like the plastic, some people like the wood.
It depends. Well, the vessel for growing an orchid in, which one do you prefer more? Depends on where you're growing them and what conditions you have. If you're growing them outside and they get rained on, you want them to dry out as quickly as possible in between watering, especially if we're getting rain every afternoon. So you would want to grow in a clay pot. Now, if your name is John Odom down in Fort Pierce and you've got 28 greenhouses and you have to go through and repot 28 greenhouses full of orchids, you want to go by cost. Plastic pot is the cheapest thing for him to use. But he uses a different potting material, which is a small gray stone called stay-lite. He uses that because it's cost effective and it doesn't rot or break down, so he doesn't have to repot as often. I hate stay-lite rock. I can't stand it. It's just awful to use. When you go to divide and clean up an orchid, it tears up your clippers. I can't stand it, but he loves it. So like I said, if you go to 5 different people, you're gonna get 5 different things. If I'm growing outside in the landscape, I try to get everything out of a plastic pot if I can, and I put everything in my house in clay pots. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
How many orchids do you have?
Over 400. I haven't counted recently because I keep buying.
How many do you keep in your house?
Right now, I've probably got about five or six in the house right now. So not including the stuff I bought at Garden Fest, which actually, come to think of it, is mostly regular plants. It's no orchids from Garden Fest. So, yes, ma'am.
Can you re-explain the orientation if you are growing, attaching an orchid to the tree? You talked about the pseudobulbs, the front and the back of the plant. And then I thought I heard you say that the back of the plant is orientated to down or the ground, and the front. So actually you're putting your plant instead of...
Let's use this oak tree as an example. If you turn around and look at these branches, all right, what you want to do is when you're growing an orchid, you want to consider rain because you want it to be able to get watered. You want to consider how it's going to grow, and then you want to be able to figure out how you're going to attach it to the tree. Now, if you look at, say, this front branch that this gentleman is leaning up against, kind of arches up and out. You don't want to put the orchid on the underside because when it rains, it's never going to get water on it. When it rains, the water's going to channel down the grooves in that bark and come down the side of the tree. So you want to put it on the side to the top of the branch, never underneath. And I've seen people, when they go to mount them, they'll put them on the underside because it's the most visible and that's where it looks pretty. Well, typically 9 times out of 10, that orchid will die because it's not getting watered. I recommend that you put them on the top side or on the side where actually rain gets on them and the rain will actually drizzle down the tree trunk and get to the roots on that plant. Now eventually, as that orchid gets bigger and bigger and it's all one plant, it will start to cover on the underside of that tree also. So, but you have to let it do it on its own. Don't do it when you start out. Now, when you're attaching, put them to the east side so that it gets some morning sunlight. Try to orientate towards the east so they get early morning sunlight, or late on the western side so that they get light on the late afternoon. Anything after 4 o'clock during the summer. If it's anywhere between like 11 and 4 during the summer, you're going to cook your orchid. So make sure it gets dappled light. Yes, sir.
Attached on the underside, or a piece of wood that's propping up above the plant that's going to rot away. 2 problems with it. I put some underneath, and some I put on pieces of wood that I propped up above the plant. And I want to move them. They got nice roots all growing in and everything. Can you do that?
Yeah, you can move them around. If it's not blooming and doing what you want, move it around until it's getting better light. Yeah.
So just do the cut number.
Well, you don't have to necessarily, is it attached to something? Well, if it's on a piece of like driftwood or something, and it's just up on a wall and all of a sudden it's attached to the wall too? Or is it just attached to the wood?
We propped up fill and used a big pine board, and it's not doing well.
I would move it. If you want to, you can remove it from the board. You can put it on something else without a problem. Yes, ma'am.
Can you cut it off and put half of it if it's big? Cut it off.
If it's big enough, yes, you can take a division off of it, and you can put it on something else too.
How big should it be?
4 pseudobulbs. If you're going to divide your orchid, when you're dividing, make sure that you do the division where you have at least 4 pseudobulbs on each part of the plant, so that it's strong enough to keep going. What used to happen back in the early 1900s, when orchids were really expensive, like that Ludiminiana, what would happen was the growers would take one of the old back bulbs and they would sell it to somebody, and you would have to take that one back bulb and hope to God that the eye would swell and grow and the plant would continue to grow. That's how they got new orchids back then. Now we've gotten into cloning and propagating and breeding. So unfortunately, back in the day, that used to be one of the only ways that you could get an orchid. Now, I did bring something here from home from my stuff. Everybody wants to know what orchids look like when they're being propagated. Orchids are grown from a seed pod. How many of you know that vanilla is an orchid? Yes. Vanilla is an orchid, and the actual vanilla pod it's an actual seed pod for the vanilla vine. The seed is actually put into flasks with an agar in the bottom of it, and there are different formulas for different types of orchids. This has a lot, you can see the black, that black is residual charcoal. And I'll let you pass that around. Do me a favor, don't shake it up, don't drop it. Those seedlings have been in there now for 3 years. And they're the agar is just about gone, so they're about ready to come out of that flask. And I'll probably take them out and put them in one pot, what we call a compot. So you'll see that some of the plants are a little bit larger than some of the others. They all started at the same time. The ones that are bigger are your stronger, probably more prolific of the seedlings. Now, if that was a cross, each one of those plants, when they bloom, each flower would be a little bit different. So if it was a clone, each flower would be the same. Most of these guys, these are all clones. So each flower, if that plant has a name on it, each flower is going to look like that. When I started putting plants in the landscape for people, I was using a little bit of Spagna Moss. I would take the orchid out of the pots or the basket or whatever they were growing in, clean everything off the roots, and I would put the plant onto the tree. And then I would take a little bit of Spagna Moss and cover the roots. The problem with that is I found that fern comes out of that Spagna Moss. So I've stopped using Spagna Moss. Now you can use like the fiber off of a coconut tree. It won't grow that fern as readily. It's still going to grow in that, but what I've done is I've gone to just bare rooting them onto the tree, tying them on, and just making sure that they're getting watered on a regular basis.
With the fork in the orchid trees, would it be a bad idea to stick it where the fork is, or easily push them in there?
Actually, if you're going to put them up in the tree, you could start at like the base of the fork, and hopefully if the plant gets big enough, it'll go up both branches. So yes, you can start at the fork. The big one out there by J.C. Park started down at the side of the tree, and it has actually gone up the 2 forks of the oak tree. So it's actually spread up both forks of the oak tree. I mean, that thing is absolutely incredible. I'm going to wrap it up because I've been talking to you for 2 hours now. I hope you guys have learned something. Now I'm going to do a shameless, thank you. I'm going to do a shameless plug. Vero Beach has a wonderful orchid society. I moved into this area in 2006. I joined the Vero Beach Orchid Society, and for some reason I've been corralled into being, a board member and, a participant where I help out at shows and stuff like that. When I moved here from Orlando, I started out with probably about 25 orchids. My collection's now well over 400. So you can see since 2006, it's gone, really, really bonkers. I bought my first orchid in 1996. Most of you that think, I've got a question, but it's too stupid to ask. No, it's not. We all started at the same place you did. So if you've got a question, don't be shy. Somebody else is going to learn from that question also. Now, let me ask a simple question. How many of you still have the original orchid that you bought? The first orchid you ever bought? That's pretty good. You don't usually hear that. Now, the first orchid I ever bought was from Tom Ritter, and I'll tell you a funny story. Tom Ritter up in Orlando and his wife Evelyn had an orchid nursery down off of Orange Avenue, just south of downtown Orlando. I used to go there with a friend. We'd walk in, she'd look around and look at orchids, and I'd go with her and hang out. Well, I bought my first orchid from them. I walked in the front greenhouse, and Evelyn had this Vandaceous orchid, Vanda type orchid, but it was a different type of Vanda. It had really big leaves, and it's usually always in bloom for Valentine's Day. This year, it's way behind. The cold weather's just kind of slowed it down. But I looked at it and looked at Evelyn. I said, Evelyn, do you have one of those for sale? No. Okay. All right. Do you know where I can get one? No. Okay. Well, if you ever divide it, I'd like to have a piece of it. I'm never going to divide it. At this point, I'm going, okay, I guess I'm never going to get that. Can I get the name of it? So maybe I can find it somewhere else. So I got the name of it. Unfortunately, Evelyn was across the street at their house mowing the lawn one day, and Evelyn had a heart attack and passed away. Evelyn's not with Tom anymore. We actually just lost Tom about 6 months ago. Tom was, I think, 97. Still growing orchids at 97. I went into the orchid nursery one day, and I found out that Evelyn had passed. I was really, sad. And I asked Tom, I said, Tom, what happened to that big orchid? We chopped it up. I said, what? I said, where is it? He goes, why? I said, I wanted a piece of it. He goes, really? I said, yeah. I paid $150 for that thing, but I still have that orchid. Now, because Evelyn was dead set against dividing that poor thing or selling a piece of it, guess what I named it? Yep. So every year during Valentine's Day, I'd say hello to Evelyn. And I saw Tom a couple of years ago. Tom wasn't going to the shows, and Ritter Orchids does come to the Vero Beach Orchid Society, and they sell out at the show. And I told Evelyn I had it, or his current wife, I told her, Linda, that I had that orchid, and she just kind of smiled at me. I'm not sure, that was the right thing to say, but it's a neat orchid, and I'm glad I've got it. It's another one of those legacy things. But the story behind it with Evelyn not wanting to do a thing, that was the first, after Evelyn died, that was the first orchid Tom went in the greenhouse and chopped up. He went in, divided it up, and sold off all of it. Tom was the grower. He was the one growing them to sell them. She was the one growing them to collect them. So it's a fun story. I've had a couple of experiences like that. The Vero Beach Orchid Society, I want to do a plug. The Vero Beach Orchid Society meets every third Thursday at the Indian River Garden Club. We meet at 7 o'clock at night. I'm the gentleman with the club that is bringing the speakers in. This year, or this month, I've got Paul Storm slated to come in, who is an orchid grower out of Sarasota, who grows Schomburgkia and Schomburgkia Cataleya hybrids. We call them Shambo cats. They're really well suited to do well out in the landscape here. The last time Paul came in, he just about sold everything out. The Orchid Society members just went nuts over his plants. His talk is called Shambo Love, and it's actually about him doing the different crosses between the Schomburgkias and the regular Cataleyas. The problem with Schomburgkias is the flower spikes get really tall. The Cataleyas, the flower spikes stay relatively short. So you bring that height back down on the Schomburgkia, but you impede the rough, rugged characteristics from the Schomburgkia. Schomburgkias are a South American and Caribbean island orchid. They're used to our climate, our heat, our sun. When you cross them back and forth, you get an orchid that'll bloom in our landscape and just go nuts. So it's a really good orchid. Now, somebody brought me a picture of a Dendrobium Nobile. Dendrobium nobles, you saw those at the show. They grow, canes up about like this and get flowers all the way up the cane. Problem with those is everybody was growing them. The issue with them is they couldn't get them to rebloom really well. The gentleman I've got that's coming in March is going to talk about how to grow those. This month I'm bringing in a bunch of those plants in 2.5-inch pots, little seedlings, for the Orchid Society members. Each Orchid Society member will be able to buy a plant. Each one will have to grow it out. We'll have a contest to see who grew it better. The deal with those dendrobiums is I'm trying to push them because once you know how to grow them, they'll grow really well and do fantastic, especially in our climate. The thing with that dendrobium is when you grow it, and this is one of those exceptions that I will tell you how to grow an orchid. And the reason being is it helps it to bloom more. I've tried growing them before, and I've only got maybe 8-9 flowers on a plant now. The ones I now have at the house in the greenhouse have 40, 50, 60 flowers on them. So there's a trick to them. The problem with the Dendrobium nobles, and there are different classes of orchids that like a winter rest. They don't want food in the winter. So about October, there's a bunch of orchids that I pull that I don't fertilize. And what that does is it gives them a rest period and gives them the energy that in the spring they'll bloom. If you fertilize them before they develop the flower spikes, that flower spike will turn into a kiki and not flower buds. So they're tricky, but you just have to know when to feed them. Now, I hope that we will see some of you at the Vero Beach Orchid Society. It's on the 21st or 22nd, I think, this month. Is it the 21st? So that's 7 o'clock at the Indian River Garden Club across from the County Administration Building. We have that every month. The month of May, we will not have a meeting in the clubhouse. We'll have our annual picnic out by Riverside Park in that little park that runs along beside the bridge. I've got some really neat speakers lined up, and it should be pretty entertaining and should be pretty educational also. I wanted to talk to you guys real quick, and I brought an example. I've gotten into a new type of orchid. Pick up one of those pencil cactus. Oh, okay, let me grab this one. Everybody knows what a pencil cactus is. Grows like a weed, especially in Florida. Grows in full sun. Here's an orchid that does the same thing. These are called To Repot Vandas. They're actually in the same family as these guys. They will grow in full sun. I bought this at the Miami show. This is a different flower I've never seen. I've probably now got about, I would say, 22 different flower varieties of this type of orchid. They're out there. The popular one is called Miss Joaquin. It's a light pink to lavender flower. This one's a little bit different. It's a funky looking flower, but if you grow these in the ground, put mulch around the bark of them, and they will put them up next to a palm tree or something and just watch them go. They're incredible. They're neat little plants, and they grow in full sun. Long, skinny leaf, full sun. It's a Terete, T-E-R-E-T, Vanda. T-E-R-E-T, Vanda. And they're hard to find at the orchid shows. Not a lot of growers carry them. Where do you get them? You have to go to the big orchid shows. A lot of the Hawaiian growers will carry them. There's a couple of them at some of the bigger shows that will carry these guys, and you have to seriously hunt for them. I've spent probably about 8 years hunting for the different colored varieties on flowers. Now, let's have a little fun. I want to thank you guys for coming out, and I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, Danny here at the nursery is getting pretty good with orchids. You can ask him or just come see us at the Orchid Society.